president will unveil a series of proposed reforms to the highest court in the land in a speech commemorating the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act at the Lyndon Baines Johnson Presidential Library in Austin, Texas, where he has just arrived. We'll bring those remarks to you here when it happens. The legislation the president is expected to propose includes term limits for the Supreme Court justices, a code of ethics for those justices, and a constitutional amendment to curb presidential immunity. It has the backing of the de facto Democratic nominee, Vice President Harris, who said in a statement, quote, "These popular reforms will help to restore confidence in the court, strengthen our democracy, and ensure no one is above the law." In short, it's meant to be a prescription for what ails the United States Supreme Court, which has had one justice with a wife who was actively involved in trying to overturn the 2020 election, another justice whose home flew a flag that was also flown by members of the mob that stormed the Capitol January 6, 2021, not to mention a seemingly endless parade of controversies surrounding gifts such as private jet travel and luxury fishing trips bestowed on the justices by right-wing billionaires, and a series of decisions as a result, maybe, overturning decades of legal precedent. Of course, the most consequential and famous of those, Roe v. Wade. In an op-ed in the Washington Post, Biden writes the following, quote, "I served as a U.S. Senator for 36 years, including as chairman and ranking committee of the Judiciary Committee. I have overseen more Supreme Court nominations as Senator, Vice President, and President than anyone living today. I have a great respect for our institutions and for the separation of powers. What is happening now is not normal, and it undermines the public's confidence in the court's decisions, including those impacting personal freedoms. We now stand in a breach. That's why, in the face of increasing threats to America's democratic institutions, I am calling for 3 bold reforms to restore trust and accountability to the court and to our democracy." While the legislation, sadly, stands virtually no chance of passing in a Republican-controlled Congress, and it would need 60 votes to overcome the filibuster in the Senate, the amendment limiting presidential immunity would have to be passed by 38 states. The proposals are an idea for Democrats to run on this year. It is the end result of years and years and years of pent-up frustration from Democrats about the Supreme Court, and it marks a profound evolution in the party's stance and the president's. The Washington Post reports, quote, "During the 2020 presidential race, Biden rebuffed calls from liberals who advocated expanding the court, but promised that he would create a commission to study potential changes. He followed through on that vow after being elected, and the commission issued a 294-page report to the president. Before Monday, Biden had not acted on the commission's report since it was approved in December 2021. And that is where we start today with the executive director of Fix the Court, Gabe Roth, and former senator and co-host of MSNBC's How to Win 2024 podcast, Claire McCaskill. And with me here at this table, distinguished political scholar and professor at Princeton University, Eddie Glaude. Guys, I guess, Claire, I'd like to start with you. Just you have seen, as everyone else, I was just talking about the evolution that's gone on here in terms of how the party thinks about the court, how the country thinks about the court, and most importantly, today at least, how President Biden thinks about the court. Tell me from a kind of 30,000-foot level, as someone who once served in the upper chamber, what do you think the consequences of this will be? Mostly political rather than substantive, but what does it mean that the party and the president moved this way?
Well, I think it's really important that the president put this marker down. Yes, you're right. The chances of this becoming enshrined in our Constitution anytime soon are not great. But it is the right thing to do. And there's no question the Roberts Court is in a crisis. The people do not trust them. The ethical lapses have been huge and notable, and most Americans realize it's not right that these guys can take all this free stuff where everybody else in government has to be very transparent and can't do those kinds of things. I think term limits have always been popular with most voters, no matter who they are for. So I think this will be popular. I think it's a good thing for the Democrats to run on, and especially the issue of whether or not a president can do anything they want and they cannot be held accountable under the law. I mean, committing crimes as president and getting a free pass, get out of jail card is not acceptable to most Americans.
Gabe, I want to talk a little about what's in these proposed reforms. And independent of their likelihood of passing anytime soon. There's a history. The court has not always been fixed. It's not always been the number of justices now. There have been rules that have been changed, but it's been a pretty long time since we've seen a significant structural reform to the court. So walk through the three reforms that the president is putting forward here and tell us about how they would work and give us a little sense of like which on a kind of order ranking basis, which do you think is the most are the most ranked most to least in terms of popularity and in terms of potential impact if they were adopted?
Sure. So in terms of popularity, I haven't seen a ton of polling on the presidential immunity question, but I do know that term limits and ethics reforms are very popular. And this has been the case for years. Before I even started Fix the Court, I did some polling on this, and term limits had 70% popularity across the board in 2014. Now I think they're 78% in 2024, according to the latest Fox Polls New. Ethics reform also in the 70-80% range. Term limits, in terms of how they would happen, it would be a biennial appointment. So a new justice would be added to the court every 2 years. There are 9 justices. 2 times 9 is 18. And actually, if you look at the historical tenure of Supreme Court justices from our founding up until about 1970, that's about what Supreme Court justices served on average. It was closer to maybe 16 or 17 years. But now, since 1970, justices are serving closer to 28 years on average. And given the amount of power that they've arrogated to themselves, that's just far, far too long and not in line with any modern democracy. All the democracies that are younger than us, which is to say all the democracies, have a tenure length or a mandatory retirement age for their top judges. Ethics reform is actually quite simple, and it's something I think akin to what Justice Kagan mentioned to the Ninth Circuit Judicial Conference on Thursday, which is just like lower court judges, for lower court judges, there is an inbox and a complaint process whereby any American can file a complaint against a lower court judge, and a committee of the judge's peers will adjudicate that claim and see if it has merit. And if it does, there will be certain disciplinary steps that can be pushed forward, such as recommendation for recusal, recommendations for ethics training or workplace conduct training, or returning of a gift. That already exists for the country's 2,300 lower federal court judges. Why it doesn't exist for the 9 Supreme Court judges, I could give you a whole long exposition to that, but we don't have time. But basically, Joe Biden is saying that should no longer be the case, that lower court judges have an ethics rubric that includes a complaints framework. The Supreme Court should have one as well.
Eddie, I guess I want to put up let's look at this little piece of polling here about where the court stands in people's reckoning right now. This is a July NBC News poll, the view of the Supreme Court. Somewhat or very positive, that's sitting at 33 right there. Somewhat or very negative, sitting at 45%. There's another full screen to put up here. Let's look at this Politico poll. New polling shows the real fallout from the Trump conviction. It says, this is from June, the least trusted group of actors did not turn out to be the usual suspects when they asked people about their trust levels in different parts of the justice system. Prosecutors, defense attorneys. No, the Supreme Court justices turned out to be the least trusted group. Just 39% of all respondents reported having a great deal or a fair amount of trust in the Supreme Court justices, a figure that roughly tracks with the court's historically low approval ratings under the conservative supermajority. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, these people are often not super popular for various reasons. Now we have the highest court in the land, which is actually kind of turned into the lowest court in the land in terms of its standing with the public. Talk about whether you think I'm interested in which of these reforms is the one that would be some combination of most plausible and also most impactful in the sense that it would start to rebuild the trust in the court.
Well, term limits seem to me to stand out immediately, right? Because you'll have this constant rotation. You wouldn't have kind of the capture of the court, as it were. But, if we pull back just for a second, John, that data shows us that there's a kind of crisis of legitimacy, right? Not only with the court, but we think about the crisis around the House of Congress, the popularity of, or the lack of popularity of the House of Representatives, or you think about the questions around the imperial presidency. So each branch of government has its troubles. And here you have an effort to respond to the view of the court as in some ways out of step, as not really acting on behalf of the country. And the irony, of course, is that the idea behind giving them life-term appointments is that the justices would not be subject to political passions, that somehow they would be above politics. But instead, what has happened is they've been captured by it. So I think that the term limits would stand out immediately in terms of your question that you asked.